They said she was dead weight the moment the wagon snapped its axle and threw her into the dust. A useless burden with legs twisted like broken reins, and the words followed her through the town like flies drawn to blood, because Lila Boone did not scream. When the bones healed wrong and she learned to walk again, with a limp that dragged time behind it, she learned early that silence was safer than pleading, that pity was a blade sharpened for the weak, and that the world measured worth in how fast you could ride or how straight you could shoot. The orphanage sold her labor to anyone who would pay, and she cleaned stalls, sorted nails, and mended shirts until her fingers bled, all while listening to men argue about leaving her behind when winter came. On the day the preacher called her an anchor dragging good souls to the bottom, she swallowed her rage and imagined the ground opening to take him first. That night the barn caught fire and everyone ran except Lila, who crawled through smoke to cut the ropes of the horses they had forgotten, dragging herself through embers until the animals burst free and trampled a path to safety. She collapsed coughing unseen, while the town slept on its conscience. By morning, the sheriff blamed her for starting the fire, because blame was easier than gratitude, and they were ready to cast her out with a sack of flour and a warning not to return. The cowboy arrived then, riding in like a rumor hardened into bone. At Brimlow, coat dusted with miles, a scar cutting his mouth into a permanent question. He watched without interrupting, eyes pale as winter rivers, and when the sheriff finished, he asked a single thing, whether anyone had seen her strike a match. No one answered. The cowboy dismounted and offered his hand to Lila as if she were a lady stepping from a carriage, not a girl with ash in her hair and pain stitched into her gait. She took it, surprised by the steadiness, and the town hissed when he said he would take her with him, because she was trouble, because she would slow him down, because men like him did not haul broken things. He smiled then, not kind, not cruel, and said weight was relative and he had carried worse. They rode out before noon, her on a mule that matched her stubborn patience, him on a horse that moved like a held breath. Miles later, when the town was a smudge behind them, he asked her name and nothing else, and she told him without apology. He told her his was Caleb Reed and that he needed someone who could see what others missed. When she asked why, he said because the land ahead was full of liars. That night they camped by a dry creek, and Lila woke to footsteps and a blade at her throat, a stranger breathing hard with hunger or fear. She did not scream. She kicked the fire, sent sparks flying, and used the mule's tether to pull the man off balance. Caleb was there in a blink, ending it with quiet efficiency that left the ground darker. He stared at Lila, afterward measuring, and said the truth then, that someone had put a price on her life, and he had come to collect her before they did. He explained nothing more, only packed up and pushed onward before dawn, forcing the miles until her leg burned and the horizon bled red, while riders ghosted their trail in shots, whispered past like warnings from God. Lila realized then that being unwanted had kept her alive, that no one watched the useless closely, and that Caleb had chosen her because she could disappear in plain sight. As thunder rolled without rain, he taught her how to listen to dirt, how to read a man's lie in his boots, how to make a body look dead without killing it, and when she asked if he planned to sell her, he said no because debts were heavier than gold, and he intended to pay one by breaking it. Caleb did not slow until the land itself rose up to argue, Badlands clawing at the sky, and Lila learned that pain could be negotiated with if you spoke to it honestly, counting steps, trading breaths for distance, because stopping was a promise the riders behind them would keep. At dusk they reached a gulch where stone swallowed sound, and Caleb pushed her behind a slab marked with old bullet kisses, whispering that names were dangerous and silence could be armor. He set snares with hands that remembered war, then handed her a revolver heavy as fate and showed her how to aim without standing straight, how to let the limp become an angle instead of a weakness. When the first rider crept close, Lila felt time stretch thin and fired once, not to kill but to shatter the lantern and throw the night into chaos, and Caleb moved like the dark had been waiting for him. Shots clean, bodies falling wrong. Afterward, he told her the truth he owed her, that years ago he had ridden with men who sold mercy by the pound, that a girl survived a massacre because someone hid her under a wagon axle, and that girl had grown into a witness the killers could not afford. Lila understood without being told, the weight of memory pressing into her bones, and she asked if she was bait. Caleb said no, she was proof, and proof needed protection until it could speak. They rode toward a mining town called Mercy's, end where the judge drank himself numb and the ground sweated poison. And along the way, Caleb taught her to leave false trails and read clouds for lies. In Mercy's End, the men watched her limp and laughed, calling her dead weight again, and Lila smiled because laughter was a mask she could wear too. She took a job sorting ore at night while Caleb met old ghosts, and she listened, learned which doors stayed locked and which men paid to keep them open. When a boy tried to steal her bread, she let him, then followed him to a shack where 3 men sharpened questions, and she memorized their faces like prayers. The ambush came at dawn, gunfire tearing sleep apart, and Lila crawled through slag to cut the town's bell rope so it rang like judgment. She dragged a wounded deputy to cover and told him where the shooters hid. And when it was done, the judge lay face down in his own spit, exposed. Caleb found her bleeding from a graze and laughed once, sharp and surprised, saying she had changed the math. That night he confessed the worst, that he had been the one to ride away from the wagon axle years before, choosing orders over a child. Lila felt the old fire return and did not strike him, because killing him would be mercy. She told him he would help her end the men who hunted her, or he would watch her do it without him. Outside, hooves gathered like thunder, and Mercy's End prepared to burn, while Lila loaded her revolver with hands that no longer shook and realized the limp had taught her balance all along. Caleb agreed without bargaining, because he knew redemption did not accept coupons, and he showed her maps burned into his mind. Routes the hunters favored, names they answered to when afraid. They staged a trap by the river where reeds whispered secrets, spreading rumors of a witness hiding lame and alone, and the lie moved faster than truth. Lila practiced falling so it looked real, practiced crying without sound, practiced waiting while men closed in, believing the story they wanted. When the first rifle cracked, she felt the bullet comb her hair and thought of the axle, of breath trapped under iron, and she rolled and fired twice, counting heartbeats. Caleb cut the flanks, turning confidence into panic, and bodies hit water with the dull finality of stones. The survivors fled, carrying terror back to their masters, and Lila stood shaking, not from fear, but from the knowledge that the hunt had finally reversed. The night swallowed their tracks as destiny tightened its noose. They rode hard into the high plains where the grass cut the wind into knives, because fear travels faster uphill, and the men left. Alive would warn the ones who paid in blood, and Lila felt the story tightening toward its end like a cinched saddle. Caleb grew quieter, his lessons finished, his glances heavier, and on the 3rd night he told her the final truth while wolves sang at a distance, that the men hunting her were not just killers but pillars, men whose names were stitched into laws, and that the massacre she survived had been ordered to erase a ledger buried under a courthouse that proved who owned the land and who stole it. Lila listened and understood the shape of the trap, that witnesses were only useful if they lived long enough to be heard, and that the law would rather hang her than listen. They reached the town at dawn, a place scrubbed clean of guilt, bunting hung for Founders' Day, and Lila walked straight through the square with her limp on display like a dare. Caleb disappeared as planned, rumor blooming behind him that he had sold her out for a pardon, and when the deputies took her, she did not resist. Because cages can be doors if you know where to lean. In the cell, she tore a strip from her dress and bound her leg tight, then loosened it until blood flowed free, pale and convincing, and she lay still when the doctor came, letting him pronounce what he wanted to believe. They carried her to the infirmary, and when night fell, the judge and 2 men entered, their faces smooth with certainty, ready to finish a problem. Lila opened her eyes and spoke their names, reciting dates and places from the ledger Caleb had taught her to memorize, and watched the color drain as proof took shape and sound. One man reached for his gun, and Caleb stepped from the shadows behind him, not to save Lila, but to block the door. The judge laughed, because power laughs when cornered, and said he would burn the town to ash before he let a crippled girl end him. Lila pushed herself upright, pain screaming, and told him the town was already burning, because Mercy's End had sent riders with copies of the ledger, because truth multiplies when chased. The judge shot Caleb through the chest, then quick and mean, and Lila felt the world tilt as Caleb fell without drama, eyes finding hers once, asking the question he wore on his mouth. She answered by throwing herself at the judge, the limp turning into momentum, the revolver barking in the tight room until the walls wore blood like a verdict. Outside, bells rang, not in alarm but celebration, and Lila dragged herself to Caleb, pressing her hands to the wound, knowing the shape of hopelessness too well to lie. He smiled, thin and real, and said weight was relative, that she had carried him further than he deserved. When he died, the sound went out of the world for a beat, then came back wrong. Lila stood alone as deputies burst in, guns raised, then lowered when they saw the bodies and heard the shouts outside as townsfolk argued with the truth arriving in bulk. The trial that followed was a theater that ate its own stage. Names falling, fortunes cracking, and Lila testified without drama. Her voice steady, her limp undeniable, the jury unable to look away from what they had tried not to see. When it was done, they offered her land, money, a quiet life stitched with apologies, and she refused all but the mule. Because ownership felt like another cage, she buried Caleb on a hill that watched the road and marked it with a stone she could lift only by leaning her whole self into it, laughing through tears at the physics of it. Years later, travelers told stories of a woman who walked the plains, finding lies by listening to the dirt, a woman who taught broken things how to move forward. In the town square, they finally raised a statue, not of founders or judges, but of a girl with a limp and a cowboy's hat at her feet. And beneath it, the words said what the land had learned the hard way, that dead weight can crush empires when it decides to stand.